Welcome to Comics with Dan. We're going to be reviewing Hello Darkness #1. So Hello Darkness is an anthology of horror stories from Boom Studios, and there's a murderer's row of talent on this book. Some of my favorite talent on this book includes letterer Becca Carey, who letters on Crocodile Black, the entire creative team from Something is Killing the Children, as there is a Something is Killing the Children story in this book, as well as a story that includes writer Garth Ennis, artist Becky Cloonan, colorist Tamara Bonvillain, and letterer Pat Brosseau. So I don't think I understood this story. I'm not sure what happened here, but it's a story about kids killing their parents, which wasn't a great start for me. There's some reason behind it, but honestly, it's not all that clear what that reason is. Becca Carey is the letterer here. She's also on Crocodile Black, and I'm a huge fan of her work there. And while the lettering here was good, it didn't really have some of that same flair that we see in Crocodile Black. These are some creepy illustrations, sort of one-panel bits, almost sort of funny. I liked these. They were enjoyable, pretty good art, decent overall. This story treats bowling like it's a big league sport, and that in and of itself is pretty funny. David Cousins' art is absolutely spectacular. I honestly can't believe I've never heard of him before, but I would definitely have him on the lookout if you're looking for up-and-coming comic book artists. Cousins' work almost reminded me of Daniel Warren Johnson in a sense, that sort of chaotic, messy line, while still staying pretty concise and detailed kind of look. It was really, I enjoyed it. It was definitely one of the highlights of this entire anthology. The story itself was almost more humorous than scary, although there was definitely a level of horror to it. More of a situational humor with the horror tied into it. A story of someone past their prime, struggling to come to terms with that, but has to do with bowling, which makes it sort of funny and sad all wrapped up into one. Overall, pretty good. Definitely one of the better stories in the anthology. This was really basic setup. Erica walks into a bar and chats up a bartender about local children being killed. It's only 5 pages, but 2 whole pages are spent showing Erica walking up to the bar and into the bar. And to a certain extent, it's valuable to the storytelling because you see the people that give her stares, but at the same time, it's kind of nothing that we haven't already seen in Something is Killing the Children. We know that locals tend to not be fans of Erica showing up in their towns. This story in the anthology was extremely uneventful, but we'll see what it sets up and where it goes. This was a pretty creepy story, very short, but this was a great example of doing a lot with a little. It's honestly so short that I can't really say anything about it without spoiling it, but I will say that it's a perfect example of leaving it to the reader's imagination to see what happens next. The first story, Contagious, I think tried to do this, but where it failed is that it provided too much detail and left out kind of the key piece that left the reader wondering. And I think that when that happens, it is more frustrating than sort of thrilling. Whereas this story, the Siren, it leaves out most details and really just provides sort of a broad brushstrokes of what is happening in the story, which allows the reader to fill in most of the gaps. And I think that makes for a more successful story. This story was uncomfortable and unsettling and sort of exactly what you want in a horror anthology. This story was absolutely disgusting. I think that was the point of the story, but it was definitely too gross for me. Having a hand sewn onto your stomach is weird enough, but everything that followed that made it even worse and weirder, and it definitely was not for me. That being said, Jody Troutman had some really great lettering here. And I liked how Steve Orlando wrote the main character. Even though the story was gross and horrible, the main character had some really interesting sort of internal thoughts to go along with and to follow. So I did like that piece of the writing. This is definitely the most loaded creative team here, and definitely a different approach to a horror story than all of these other stories. This story is essentially taking the world today and turning it into a horror story. It starts out with one of the most insufferable political conversations I've ever heard, and all I could think about was, if this was my friend group, then I would probably spend a lot of time alone. I do think that this may have been Ennis's intent when he wrote this story, based on where the story went, but it was still a little difficult to read because I just found myself getting more and more annoyed by the conversation they were having. Becky Cloonan and Tamara Bonvillain are a really nice combination. They work great together. It's interesting to see how Bonvillain colors Cloonan differently than she does Dan Mora, because the colors that she uses for Cloonan are much flatter and I think complement her art style more, whereas she uses sort of brighter, poppier colors for Dan Mora, and it makes sense because they generally work together on superhero books or, high fantasy books like Once and Future. Interestingly, the tone throughout the entire book is sort of this sickly green and yellow, which plays well into the absolutely ridiculous conversation they're having. Brosseau's letters do a really good job of guiding the reader, which is important because this was a really dialogue-heavy story. As the story doesn't have a lot of, visible emotion, there wasn't really a lot of opportunity for creative lettering, but what was important is that the reader get guided through this conversation and be able to follow what they're talking about, and that's what the letters do here. The first issue of the anthology overall was pretty good. I do like that it had a variety of different types of horror stories, and I'm really excited to see where the Something is Killing the Children story as well as the war story go next. I like the idea that some of the stories will continue to next issue, and we can expect to see new stories in the next issue that will be sort of standalone. I think it lends itself well to having recurring readers that will pick up every issue versus having readers that will just grab issues based on a creative team that they like or a story that sounds interesting to them. Make sure you like the video, make sure that you subscribe, check out my other videos here, and